Lord, please. Just one more. Just one more. A soldier whispered this prayer over and over that night. He carried no weapon, only a rope and 2 hands. And before dawn, he said it 75 times. April 1945. The island of Okinawa, Japan's last line of defense. It had taken years for the Pacific War to reach this point. But now it was here, and both sides knew this would be the final major battle. The soldiers of the 77th Infantry Division gathered in the early morning hours. Ahead of them stood the Maeda Escarpment. The Americans had given it another name, Hacksaw Ridge. Why? Because when you looked over the edge of that plateau, you saw nothing but a sheer rock face dropping straight down, 30 meters to the ground below. You needed rope ladders just to climb it. You went up without knowing what was waiting at the top, and at the top, the Japanese were waiting. Among the soldiers stood one man. He wasn't particularly tall or broad. He came from the mountains of Virginia, from a small town near Lynchburg. His name was Desmond Doss. And that morning, there was no rifle on his shoulder, only a medic's bag. Just a medic's bag. The men around him watched, some with mockery, some with curiosity, some with quiet concern. This was the man who had refused to touch a rifle back at training camp, who had been dragged in front of a court-martial, who had nearly been sent to prison. And yet here he was, gripping that same rope alongside everyone else. Desmond Doss had no weapon, but the thought of staying behind never once crossed his mind.
The Maeda Escarpment, known as Hacksaw Ridge, was one of the most strategically critical positions in the entire Battle of Okinawa. Whoever controlled the plateau controlled the surrounding terrain. The Japanese had spent months preparing their defenses, an intricate network of tunnels, reinforced bunkers, and concealed machine gun positions. The 77th Division's orders were to take the escarpment. Their commanders knew from the start it would not come cheaply. American casualty estimates were high before the first soldier even set foot on the ridge.
Desmond Doss's story didn't begin at Hacksaw Ridge. It began years earlier. It was 1942. America had entered the war. Like thousands of young men across the country, Desmond enlisted. But almost immediately, there was a problem. When weapons training day came, Desmond refused to pick up his rifle. It wasn't fear. It wasn't weakness. Desmond Doss was a Seventh-day Adventist, and his faith left no room for debate on one point: thou shalt not kill. For Desmond, this wasn't something to be argued over or reinterpreted. It was simply true. The army didn't understand. His officers didn't understand. His fellow soldiers didn't understand. Back at training camp, the pressure was relentless. Men threw his boots across the barracks. They kept him awake at night. They called him a coward. They called him a traitor. According to later testimony from soldiers who were there, some actively tried to have him removed from the unit by any means necessary. Desmond didn't leave. Eventually, the army took it further: a formal court-martial. They wanted him discharged on grounds of conscientious objection. Desmond stood up in that courtroom and said, "I'm not running from anything. I want to serve. I just can't kill. Let me serve as a medic. I can still do something." The court let him go. The army shipped him to the Pacific, and in April 1945, Desmond Doss gripped that rope alongside his entire company and climbed toward Hacksaw Ridge. He didn't know what was waiting at the top, but he knew every corner of his medic's bag, every vial of morphine, every roll of bandage. He knew those by heart.
Desmond Doss held the official designation of non-combatant, meaning he carried no weapon, yet served on the front line. It was one of the most exposed positions in any unit. Medics couldn't fight back, and they couldn't fully retreat. Within the 77th Division, medical personnel casualty rates were not significantly lower than those of combat soldiers. Being unarmed on the front line of Okinawa was not a safer position. In many ways, it was a more vulnerable one.
Early May 1945, the 77th Division had made it to the top of the plateau. But the Japanese were far stronger than anyone had anticipated. The first assault wave pulled back with heavy losses. So did the second. By the end of the third day, hundreds of wounded men lay scattered across the plateau. and every Japanese counterattack pushed the American line further back. Command made the call: withdraw, give up the plateau, get down. When the order reached the company, the men started moving. They were exhausted, they were scared, and they wanted to get down to the safe side because they wanted to stay alive. Desmond Doss decided to stay. It wasn't a sudden decision. When Desmond looked around, he still saw men moving, still saw men breathing, wounded soldiers who hadn't been evacuated. Some had lost consciousness. Some no longer had the strength to make a sound. They just lay there, on the ground, still. One thought moved through Desmond's mind: I can't leave them. No one from the retreating company stopped him. No one tried to force him down, because the Japanese were everywhere, and staying on that plateau alone meant something close to certain death. Desmond knew that. He stayed anyway. What he had was simple: his medic's bag, a few bandages, morphine, and a long rope. He would use that rope more than he ever expected.
The Japanese tunnel network on Okinawa presented a serious tactical problem for American forces throughout the battle. Japanese soldiers would pull back during daylight hours, then move through tunnels at night to reoccupy lost positions. This meant that control of the plateau had to be re-established almost every single morning. The 77th Division's daily casualty rate in this sector ranked among the highest recorded anywhere in the Pacific War.
Alone on the plateau, Desmond Doss crawled toward the first wounded man. Standing up was not an option. Japanese snipers tracked every movement. Desmond pressed himself flat and pulled himself forward, moving toward the sound of a voice. When he reached the man, his leg had been shattered. Desmond dressed the wound, gave him morphine, then took out the rope. He had to get him to the edge of Hacksaw Ridge and then lower him down. 30 meters of sheer rock face. Desmond tied the rope to a tree, dragged the wounded man to the edge, wrapped the rope around him, and slowly lowered him down. One, done. One man below. Then he turned back. The next wounded soldier was further away. Desmond crawled again. Machine gun fire somewhere in the distance. No way to tell exactly where. Explosions. Screaming. There was no wind on the plateau, and the smell of gunpowder had settled into everything. Desmond later described it this way: every time I reached one of them, I just kept thinking, one more, just one more. Hours passed. Desmond wasn't counting. There was no time to count. Reach, dress, wrap, lower. Reach, dress, wrap, lower. By nightfall, his hands were trembling from exhaustion. His medical supplies were running low, but there were still sounds coming from the plateau. When morning came, a count was made at the American position below. The number of wounded men Desmond Doss had lowered down that night: 75. Alone, unarmed, in a single night.
The lowering technique Desmond Doss developed that night was later referred to as the Doss knot. The method he improvised for getting wounded men safely down the cliff face went well beyond anything covered in standard medical evacuation procedures. Official military records confirm 75 men evacuated that night. Some historians have suggested the true number may have been higher, but 75 is the figure supported by the documented record.
The next day, Desmond was back on top of the plateau. He had brought down 75 men, but the battle wasn't over. The 77th Division climbed again, and the fighting continued. Desmond was there with his company because there would still be wounded men. There would still be someone who needed him. In the middle of May 1945, the Japanese launched a sudden night raid. Grenades scattered in every direction. Desmond jumped into a shell crater. A few other soldiers were already inside. The explosion was close, too close. A grenade landed right at the edge of the crater. Desmond saw it. There was no time to throw it back. He leaned down and kicked it away from the group with his leg. It went off. 17 shrapnel fragments tore into his legs. He was on the ground, unable to move. The other soldiers tried to carry him. Desmond refused. "There are men worse off than me," he said. "See to them first." While he waited on the stretcher, a Japanese sniper fired. The bullet hit his wrist. Desmond rolled off the stretcher and pulled himself behind a tree with one arm. He wrapped his own wrist with a bandage. Then he took a rifle stock and used it as a splint to stabilize his leg, and he began to crawl. 300 meters, alone, without calling for help. When he finally reached an evacuation point, the doctors couldn't make sense of what they were looking at. The man had done something that defied reason, but all Desmond could say was, "There are still men up there."
The wounds Desmond Doss sustained were clinically life-threatening, 17 shrapnel fragments and an additional gunshot wound, and yet he covered that distance entirely on his own. From a medical standpoint, this was extraordinarily unusual. Post-war assessments suggest that Doss consciously suppressed his pain response during this period, drawing on the same inner conviction that had carried him through everything that came before.
When Desmond Doss came home, he returned quietly to his small town in Virginia. He didn't want a ceremony. He didn't want to give speeches, but Washington wouldn't let him disappear. Harry Truman invited him to the White House. There was going to be a medal ceremony. Desmond had no choice but to attend. On the day of the ceremony, as Truman pinned the medal to his chest, he looked at Desmond and said, "This is one of the greatest honors I have been given the privilege to bestow." Desmond later recalled that moment simply, "I just did my job. I wasn't thinking about anything else." But the way he had done his job had changed something. The soldiers who had thrown his boots across the barracks, the ones who called him a coward, the officers who pushed him toward a court-martial. Many of them came forward afterward and spoke publicly about Desmond. His company commander, Captain Jack Glover, put it this way, "You had to see Hacksaw Ridge to understand what that man was. I saw it." Desmond's story wasn't just about one man's courage. It pointed to something else entirely. Could a person hold to their own values, harm no one, and still exist in the middle of war? Desmond Doss answered that question. Yes, they could.
Desmond Doss was the only conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II, the highest military decoration the United States Army can award to a non-combatant. His story reached a global audience decades later, when Mel Gibson adapted it into a feature film in 2016. But the original testimonies had been captured much earlier, in a 2004 documentary titled The Conscientious Objector, long before the wider world knew his name.
Life after the war wasn't easy for Desmond Doss. Tuberculosis in his lungs advanced slowly over the years. He lost hearing in one ear. Then, in an accident, he lost an arm. He lived quietly in his Virginia home. He didn't talk much. He turned away from interviews. But from time to time, young people would come to his door. They would ask questions. "How did you do it?" they'd say. "Weren't you afraid?" Desmond's answer was always the same. "I was afraid. Every single night I was afraid. But there were men up there, and I was there. What else was I supposed to do?" That one sentence says a great deal. Desmond Doss never saw himself as a hero. He saw himself as someone who happened to be there, someone who did what he could with what he had. In 2006, he passed away at the age of 87, quietly in the small town near Lynchburg where he had always belonged. Hacksaw Ridge is still there. The rocks haven't changed. The wind still moves the same way across the plateau. But at the edge of those rocks, on one night in 1945, a silent prayer was repeated 75 times. And that remains one of the strangest and most deeply human moments this war ever produced. One man, no weapon, a rope, and an unshakable decision not to leave. "Lord, just one more, just one more."
Desmond Doss's story continues to be referenced in discussions of military ethics and freedom of conscience. The question of how an individual navigates the tension between personal belief and institutional duty, and how that tension can produce outcomes no one anticipated, remains a subject of genuine interest to historians and military scholars alike.